In this video, we're gonna double your in-game IQ with these 5 tips that are gonna make you a smarter, better player and better prepare you to climb next season in Season 4. So if you want to improve at a dramatic rate, let's jump right in. But do me a huge solid and smash that like, subscribe, and let's get into the content. And now, one of the most important skills that you can learn that will pay you dividends in your development as a player is learning how to self-VOD review. Now, I do offer VOD reviews myself, links will be in the description, but self-VODing allows you to VOD yourself consistently and you get to improve at a dramatic rate, and best of all, it's completely free. So how do you self-VOD review? Well, after you had a really rough game, I want you to go back and look through every single death you had first. These are really pivotal points, telling points, that will showcase many mistakes you're making. If you died way away from your team, it was a positioning mistake. Perhaps you had a person dead to rights, but missed a whole bunch of shots, mechanical one. Or perhaps you thought an ability or ultimate was not ready, but it was, and you died to that, and that was one that was centered around your game sense. Basically, using your deaths as a starting point for VOD review focus is really good if you're learning to VOD review yourself at the very beginning. On top of that, ultimates, not only your ultimates, but opponents' ultimates and how you interact with those and how well you execute yours. And last up, fights around key objectives or key capture points like uncontrolled point, first, second, or third, or when you're about to lose or win a potential game. Those fights are ones that really matter. Now, by evaluating what you're doing wrong, hyper-focusing on these things, you're going to be able to quickly notice mistakes that you never saw while you were playing, and by slowly eradicating mistakes, that's how you become a much better player, because the one true difference between someone that's in gold and someone that's in Grandmaster is the Grandmaster player makes so many less mistakes, and it's a linear decrease in mistakes as you climb up the ranks. The next up, something that you need to learn is how to track ultimates. Knowing when and what ultimates are coming up is incredibly important. Imagine you try to go and dry blade a Mercy, but she pops Valk and flies away, and now you're stranded and you die. Or imagine you want to rush as Kiriko, so you rush right in front of an enemy Rein and he shatters your whole team. But if you knew that the shatter was there, you could have saved Suzu and used it reactionarily, specifically for the shatter, and countered the entire thing. So while you know you need to track ultimates, it can be really hard. So how do you? Well, an easy way to start off with is the death cam. Of course, you're gonna know whether or not an enemy has their ultimate, but this one can be a little tricky because you ideally wouldn't be dead, especially not to the specific character, so it's not gonna be 100%. The next thing that you can do is monitor that person's impact level. You can use the scoreboard as well, monitoring how much heals and damage they're doing. While this isn't going to be a perfect science and you're not gonna be able to calculate it on the fly, you will know at the very least if like a Genji has like 500 damage in 2 or 3 minutes, he might not actually have that blade, so it's something to consider. Now, the other thing that you should do is decide who to focus on, because trying to track every ultimate is a little bit difficult. Instead, track the ultimates that you can mirror or track the ultimates that you counter. So the mirror would be tracking the other character that is playing exactly what you're playing. These are pretty easy to track because you know how much impact you're getting directly relative to them, so you have a great point of reference, and this could be really important for matchups like the Rein v Rein, knowing that you have your shatter before them, and that means that you don't have to play around it and you can go for a proactive play without worried about getting counter shattered, or vice versa. The counter one is a little bit trickier because you have to track the ultimate of a character that could shut down your play, like we talked about with the Kiriko to Rein, or maybe a Zarya has grab and you're trying to nano blade and you know you're going to get grabbed, or maybe it's the Valkyrie Mercy up into your aggressive play. The idea here is that you think about what ultimates could shut you down and you focus heavily on trying to track those and monitor the impact level of that player so that those ults don't interfere with you. And it's not as important to directly track some of the other menial ults that don't directly interact with you, but of course if the enemy team goes through multiple team fights without using it, then you could just imagine that they have it. Now, the next thing that's going to increase your in-game IQ and make you a better player is learning how to adapt or swap. Now, what this ultimately means is that you need to think about what your team is trying to accomplish and work in that same direction. Like, you got to understand that some tanks want to play the game fundamentally different, right? A Sigma wants to poke from afar. A Rein wants to brawl in. A Winston wants to jump in and dive. And every single character is going to want to do a specific thing. And while you don't necessarily have to pick a character that does exactly what that tank is doing, you need to understand that that's the flow that is being pushed upon you. The key here is to not act in opposition to your team's natural flow. If the natural flow of the team is to poke and stay back, you have a Zen, a Sigma, and you're playing Tracer trying to one-clip enemies in the backline, and you have 3 people turning on you, someone using Suzu on you, and you getting naded, and you're like, what the heck, I'm baiting out so much cooldowns and getting so much attention. But you have to understand that what you're doing is in direct opposition to the natural flow of your team, the natural play state of your team. They're not trying to bait out those cooldowns. They're not trying to pressure the backline. They're trying to win in a game of attrition. And you don't have to swap off of Tracer to play that same game of attrition, but you can't go for these aggressive one clips, these dive plays, when your team isn't playing for that. So it's about learning when you can adapt. And if you can't adapt, then you have flexible picks that you could swap to, of course. But a lot of characters can adapt to a composition if you understand what is the team's natural flow and play to that. Most of the time that centers around the tank. But it definitely is the overall building block of what the team is trying to accomplish. And if you have players on your team that are working with your flow, like maybe you have a poke tank and you have other supports like a Kiriko that's teleporting in and some other diver that's going with you, then you can play for that and you're not playing against your overall team flow. So it's not just about following whatever one person is doing, it's about following what the team is doing, working with it instead of trying to work against it. Now, the next thing that you need to learn, and this is so important for your development as a player and it increases your in-game IQ, is learn to evaluate advantage versus disadvantage. What side is winning the fight? Who is low? Is the enemy team super low? Is your team super low? Who has numbers advantage? Is it the enemy team or is it your team? Who has ultimates? Is it your team or the enemy team or both teams? Now we're starting to see building blocks. We talked about tracking ultimates, and this stacks right on top of that because it's an important metric that you need to know advantage versus disadvantage. And the reason that this one is so important is that you need to evaluate this so that you can better decide between risk and reward. Basically, there are some plays that you can make on a character that has a very high reward, but it's really risky. Think of like a flank high noon or a really aggressive play in the enemy backline where you're going all in and maybe it kills all of them and maybe it kills none of them, but you're giving up your position. You're giving up the play for the team. And oftentimes, if you do a play like this and it goes wrong, you're going to be the reason that your team loses because you die. And this is what I would call a risk versus reward play. And most of the time, these types of plays are not reliable enough or consistent enough to go each and every time because it's easier to be responsive as a team than be clutch as an individual, right? But here's the thing that you need to understand. As your team starts to create more and more disadvantage, the risk of a play is less and less, while the reward can become more and more, potentially. And to explain this, let's say you're already down 2 or 3 players, and as Cassidy, you wouldn't even be able to get out if you tried. If you tried to run away and get out, you're going to lose. You're going to die. They're going to chase you down. You might even stagger. But if you go for a flank play, double dink the Ana, stick another opponent, shoot them in the body, get 2 kills, and somehow get away, all of a sudden, a fight that you would have lost is a fight that you can back off for a second, get your team to regroup, go in, and the opponents just die, or they have to back up, and you won the fight. You understand how, because you were at such a disadvantage, a risk to reward play become more appealing. And this is super important, because if you try to go for these risky plays all the time, even when you have an advantage, you could throw an advantage. You have a really risky play, you already have a pick, there's no point in trying to play for a high risk, high reward play, and it's even riskier because you take all of that value that you already have and level it because you threw away your life. But if you're at a disadvantage, then it becomes more appealing and stronger to do. So this is a really great evaluation where if you learn to properly evaluate advantage versus disadvantage, it's going to directly change what type of plays you're going for. Another example of this is with ultimates. If you're walking into a fight where maybe you're close to ultimates, right? And the opponents have a ton of them. You could say, hey, let's play slow. Let's try to kite these ultimates so that we can build our ultimates so that we can gain that advantage. We're going to exchange time for potentially advantage. But what if you're not close to ultimates at all? And you're going to eat 3, 4, 5 ultimates right to the face. This is a situation where you as an entire team might go make a risky play, an aggressive play, a play that might normally have a high risk but a high reward. But in this situation, if you let the fight play out naturally, where the opponents have a huge ult advantage onto you, you're gonna lose it. So you have to find a way to break that parity. And basically, by having a clear evaluation of advantage or disadvantage with all these factors, it's going to directly change how you take and play every single engagement. And it's so important. And if you think about the game this way, you're going to improve dramatically. Now, the fifth thing, and this is an incredibly important thing that you need to learn, and that's to play in the sweet spot of your composition. So every single composition is going to have an effective range. We talked about this with the adapt or swap tip, where certain characters or certain teams have a flow, a natural flow. And a lot of what that is playing in your team's effective range. What is your team good at? What is their strength? Is your team a poke composition? Are you good at playing from distance? Do you have a sniper or double sniper? Are you trying to take pot shots? Are you a dive composition that wants to jump on an isolated target? Are you a brawl composition that wants to go at a target and swing onto them? And typically a lot of this stuff is centered around your tank. You got to understand that when your team is in their effective range, their sweet spot, this is where you conserve cooldowns, and this is where you fight the enemy for as long as possible in that sweet spot. And cooldowns are used to create that sweet spot or to deny the opponent from creating that sweet spot. So as an example, if you're a team comp that wants to fight at range compared to your opponents, they're a dive composition and you're some amalgamation, you don't want to be throwing your cooldowns from range, because when the opponents are initiating a dive and they're on top of you and they are actually in their sweet spot, their effective range, that's where you want to have your cooldowns. That's where you want to be able to respond with nades, with sleeps, with packs, with every single ability in your kit. You want to have it there. But if you utilize your rolls, if you utilize your rocks, if you utilize all of these cooldowns that help you fight when the opponent is in their range, when you're in yours, and then you no longer have it when they're in their range, that's how you lose a fight instantly. It's about playing slow and playing default when you're in that range. As long as the opponent doesn't enter in their sweet range, then you can chill. You don't have to use cooldowns. You can vibe there all day. But the second they cross that threshold, you have a sandbagged amount of abilities ready to dump on them. Now, this is something that people understand on an individualistic level, but they don't really understand it from a team level. Like, let's take the Cassidy versus Genji matchup. If Cassidy's playing at range from Genji, he doesn't need to use roll aggressively, because as long as the Genji's far away, Cassidy has that advantage. And if the Cassidy wastes roll when he's in his sweet spot up against the Genji, then he's uniquely vulnerable to a play made by the Genji that closes in the distance, no longer having a cooldown to protect him. Now, just apply that to the entire team composition on both sides, and all of a sudden you understand this concept a lot better. Now, if you have any questions about this, definitely let me know in the comments down below, and of course, smash that like and subscribe if you enjoy the content. Thank you so much for coming by, and I'll see you next time.